Welcome to Fitness and Consciousness. I'm your host, Ryan Hadley, and my guest today is Greg Monzel. He's a community herbalist, and he's going to be teaching us about plant consciousness and what all that means today. So thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm happy to be here. As an herbalist, plant consciousness is something that I think about a lot when I am out, especially in the woods or nature and hanging out with plants. I think about what it feels like for them to have me walking across their roots and touching their stems. I wonder if they feel it. I wonder what they're thinking, what they're wondering, if they're wondering and thinking. All these kind of questions go through my mind. And there's been a lot of recent research that has come out to really support scientifically through observation that plants do have many of the qualities we normally would have ascribed to just animals and not to plants. And I think the fundamental thing to observing some of those phenomena is just being able to slow down our own perception of time and to put time in a scale where we're thinking about our lifetime being hundreds or thousands of years for plants rather than the very limited scope I think we get in our brief windows here on Earth.
Yeah. I've read a few books on plant consciousness, and so in what ways can you tell that they're conscious? So I was reading something like if they know that an animal that eats them may be getting close, they emit some kind of chemicals so they don't taste as good or something like that. Am I on the right track to where you're...
Yeah, so that's one way we can look at it is through plant communication and kind of social behavior between individuals. And there's some interesting research. You can look at, for instance, I heard about a study of kudu in Africa that were on sort of these put-and-take hunt type ranches. So they're a herd animal, they're herbivores, and this was a drought period in this part of Africa where I forget exactly where this was taking place. But the only plants that were resilient enough, given the very sparse rainfall they'd had, were the acacia shrubs, which are a thorny, drought-resistant member of the legume family that have thorns that make them kind of less attractive to herbivores typically. But here they are. These kudu have developed the ability to get their tongues around the thorns and be able to eat the leaves. And so as they eat them, it triggers this response in the plants. It triggers them to put up their defenses against the kudu. And in this case, their ability to defend themselves is based on production of a chemical called tannins that are really important for medicinal purposes, for tanning hides and other human uses. But the plant uses them to prevent herbivory, or the eating of the plant. If you've ever tasted an unripe persimmon, you know exactly what astringent is. It's this drying effect. It causes proteins to tighten up, and so it dries out your mouth, it dries up secretions, which can be a good thing if you're leaking fluids out somewhere. So tannins are really important for first aid to help stop bleeding. But in the case of these kudu, the acacia shrubs were increasing their tannin to 4 or 5 times the normal level. And if you think about that quality of tightening proteins in your digestive tract, you can think about all those membranes in there that are supposed to be absorbing nutrients across this protein-based membrane are now being dried out, tightened up, and shriveled up, and function is reduced there. So that's not a good thing for your ability to persist as an animal. Excessive amounts of tannins combined with proteins in your diet can, in people, produce a condition known as bezoars, one of my favorite clinical terms. And they sometimes require surgical intervention, and the tannins react with the proteins, create this kind of wood pulp-like substance, and these can create obstructions in the bowel. So I don't know exactly what was killing the kudu, but the plant was essentially killing the kudu with tannins. So you have this spike in population in the kudu with a reduction of of herbs in the environment due to the drought. So then they're focusing on these particular shrubs. The shrubs then produce tannins that defend the plants because it's wiping out this kudu population. From In this study they were looking at the population density of the kudu on these ranches, and they found that even in areas where they were not being over-harvested by the kudu, the acacia shrubs were still producing excessively high amounts of tannins in response. And they were able to determine it was a pheromone exchange through the air that basically, when you smell a plant, when you smell the smell of thyme or parsley or magnolia flower, you're smelling something that smells great to us, maybe, or maybe not if it's a stinky plant like skunk cabbage. But the plants are using that in a different way. For them, they're not just smelling it for fun. They're using those chemicals to communicate with each other and send messages. So they can then help create a larger kind of sort of herd immunity, similar to the way that we have viral resistance due to antibodies and vaccines. So that's just one way plants can communicate, is through gases, through volatiles that they'll produce. Sometimes they're called green leafy volatiles. And think of any essential oil as being one of these potentially. Humans love essential oils. You can buy all kinds of different essential oils of plants, and of course we like them for smells. They often have very medicinal qualities for us. And plants often use them, again, to reduce something eating them. Interestingly, I think some insects will harvest those specifically, though, to combat their own diseases. And the case in point here is honeybee. Honeybee will gather the pollen and nectar from ground ivy and other mint family plants that have a high essential oil content to bring back to the hive to help clean the mites from them.
Interesting.
So we can use those for the same kind of thing as antimicrobials. Thyme, which is one of their favorites for this purpose, the constituent thymol that's found in that is actually still considered a drug as an antibacterial, antiseptic drug that's plant-derived.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. What do you think was I was kind of like changing directions a little bit, but how do you think, people before we had these, before you knew about tannins and these different chemicals, and how do you think people originally knew what plants to eat and what not to eat, or your, dogs or whatever animal, how do they know, what to eat? I guess is that.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I've often wondered this. How did our ancestors learn what is okay to eat, what's poisonous,
what's medicine,
how it works in the body? And I think a lot of scientists, kind of the prevailing idea seems to just be that it's been through trial and error. But to me, that seems like an ignorant fallacy. There's too much interconnection. We've been using these plants for so long. In medicinal herbalism, there are plants that have been found in 50,000-year-old sites that I still use today. And, we've been using these plants for longer than we've been a species, probably. Some of these food plants in particular. There's a very mysterious element, I think, with plants that we still don't understand in their ability to communicate with people. And in traditional indigenous cultures, the prevailing ideas about where we learned these things is not only from our ancestors who taught us these things, but that our ancestors and we can learn directly from the plants. And that in dream time or in pursuing these types of experiences with plants and being able to, again, kind of change our perception of consciousness enough to where we can get into that time space with the plants and where we can access each other. There's a little magic there that we still haven't figured out on a scientific level, but I'm confident that we'll get there if we can.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Even if your dog grew up always in a house in suburbia, but you take him outside, he'll know what to eat. Maybe he has his stomach ache, and so they kind of make themselves sick on purpose. I think it's on purpose. Mm-hmm. Or they'll know just what to eat and what not to eat. And I was reading some book. I can't remember the name of it right now, but this Westerner went to learn from the shaman in somewhere in South America. I don't know if it was Peru or something like that. And he starts to walk around the jungle with the shaman, and he's like, "What's this plant for? What's this plant for?" I think the book was called Plant Spirit Medicine.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was the name of it. And the shaman's not saying anything. He's just kind of like laughing at him.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the Westerner, he gets back to the shaman's house, and his family is there, his kids and his wife. And they're making fun of the Westerner because he thought that this plant did this and that plant did that. But what this shaman did, which I don't know if I've read it from another source or not, but he was like, it's not the minerals or the vitamins in the plant that's healing you, it's the spirit in the plant.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like that this plant does this and that one does that. It's that, like, this is the plant that I use to heal people, regardless of what their problem is. So do you have you
mm-hmm.
like gone into like down that rabbit hole
mm-hmm.
or?
Yeah. That really takes me to like some of the personal work and personal healing that's part of my story. I come from a family of like engineers and nurses, which they're very scientifically minded people, very pragmatic, little tinkerers, and those kind of folks. And so, and in Western culture, we have this again. It's like there's a use for this. What's the use? Like mm-hmm. to me, that's in that story. That's part of the problem of the Westerner is that he's saying, what's this used for? Instead of, how can we work together here? How can we cooperate with these plants? There's often this kind of usurping, taking quality that we have in our Western culture. But anyway, that aside, so in my story, I started out looking at again kind of the chemistry in the plants. It's very validating to me as a skeptic that there is chemistry in these plants that you can look at and study directly, and its physical properties, its effects on physiology in the body, similar to like drug mechanisms of action and just simple physiology. I am somewhat, refreshed by that, and compared to other types of alternative medicine that you can't necessarily establish that physical connection. So that's part of why I pursued herbalism specifically. But then as I've experienced and as I've gained greater relationship with the plants over time, I've had a number of experiences that I cannot explain in any kind of scientific way of what I feel like have been direct communications with plants. And in those ways, the plants, I've learned to use them in a different way, not based on their chemistry, but based on that spirit property. And the plant will tell me directly in those experiences how and when to use it and for who and why. And it's very clear in those and it's weird. It's almost like the voices inside your head talking to you. It's not coming from outside somewhere. It's like it's within you already. And I can sometimes feel the plant inside me or visualize it in some way in these experiences that are, again, kind of outside of our normal waking consciousness. I'm not saying I'm not using drugs or something here. I'm not taking plant drugs. That's not what I'm talking about. These are plants that have been known for, millennia as being plants that have a strong spirit for a certain reason, and they can definitely come and talk to you. And if you don't treat them well, they can also come and get you back. They can in a spiritual way. It's weird. But by listening to those messages, the more that I listen to those messages, the more that I use that spirit part of it, the better I am at helping people with their health, and the better results I see. I find it to be far superior to the kind of more chemical-based approach. Although I still use that. I still use a tissue physiology-based approach where, if I see, again, to use tannins as an example, if I see inflamed and wet tissue that's leaking a lot of fluids, I'm going to think about putting a drying tannin on it. That just makes sense. But if I'm seeing, that's a first aid application. That's a survival purpose. If I'm seeing someone who is chronically depressed and they are a veteran and they have post-traumatic stress disorder, and these are very chronic, more spiritual, psychic issues that they're working on. That's not a situation where I think you can just give a chemical-based medicine and expect a good result. And we've seen that in clinical practice. We can see now that even modern SSRI medications, when you compare them to placebo, that there's not really a significant difference in modern clinical use. And so by approaching the plants and working with them on that level, asking them what they want in the relationship too, how we can give back to the plants in that give and take relationship, we build community, I think, with these plants. And in that way, we get out of the isolated, this sort of illusion of isolation that we have as being separate from nature. And that's one place I think that the plant magic is really special, that we can really we are truly embedded in nature. And it's a myth to think that we are not in any way, that we are an unnatural species. We eat plant foods and animal foods. They come from nature. We use wood and mineral-based materials that come from nature to build our homes. And we used earth-based and wind and solar-based energy sources that all come from nature. We spend so much time thinking about ourselves as separate from nature and living our little human lives that is pathological for us. And I think that's the root of a lot of chronic issues that people have, is this lack of connection to nature and living in community with plants in some way. Our ancestors all either grew or gathered plants on practically a day-to-day basis, or ate those foods that maybe were preserved, and have this intimate relationship with the life cycle of the plants, understanding the plants, giving back to the plants so the plants provide them with food. And we have lost a lot of these cycles, and I think that restoring those can be really powerful in bringing healing to people.
Yeah. So when you said that when the plant communicated with you, were you already aware? Were you already reading about like the shaman approaches? So you already knew about it, and then it happened, or was it a surprise?
Mm-hmm. Or I became interested in shamanism for whatever reason at a pretty early age. I found it to be a really interesting phenomenon when I was like 7 or 8 and started asking questions about it. It was one of the first jobs I thought I'd ever want to do. I never realized it wasn't just a normal job until much later. Much like my life as an herbalist now is very much an alternative type profession. There's no established route to being a professional herbalist in the United States, but that's very different from the 300,000 years of human history that we have as a modern species, where that's been a prevailing role for someone in the community. A prevailing job for somebody to have has been being an herbalist. And it's only in the last 130 years in Western civilization that has changed. 80% of the world still uses herbal medicine as their major internal medicine source. So to get back to your question about shamanism specifically, yeah, so I was and am aware of traditional shamanism, but I've never been trained in any of those types of practices. So I was an early kind of an early adapter to meditation. Also, I started meditating when I was also about 8 years old. My mom was into it, and she taught me how to meditate, and so I did simple meditations nightly for until I was about 16 years old.
What style? Just out of
focusing the breath on sitting meditation, focusing on counting the breaths and the sensation of the breath, kind of on the tip of the nose. Focusing that energy right there, and I always used a candle to help focus my mind. Oh. And I guess honestly that does tie into it a little bit. I had a lot of experiences in meditation that were intense, psychological, spiritual experiences that have definitely impacted my perception in life and my path in life that predate any interest in herbal medicine. So maybe that's helped inform me and help. I think having that early, meditation, being able to focus my mind, and quiet my mind, has been really valuable in studying nature and doing the work that I do ever since. But these specific experiences, I can honestly, I've worked with a practitioner of what is it? Somatic based therapy, or it's like somatic experiencing type therapy work, and that's where I've really in doing that work is where I've really connected the most with plants. And so in that work, what I'm doing is I work with a practitioner who helps facilitate this for me, but I'm listening to my body, and I'm centering, grounding, and I'm listening to my body and the physical sensations that are arising, and just allowing them to have space and allowing unresolved energy to be able to speak. And for whatever reason in those experiences, in many cases it leads me to some plant that's waiting to give me a message for how it can help me return to balance. And it usually has something it wants back. And I don't know why. I think my practitioner is amazing, and I think she is a shaman herself and doesn't call herself that, doesn't approach it as that.
Yeah, most of them
But that's
don't,
how
right?
it feels,
Yeah.
That's very much what I think of her. And I've recommended other people see her for what I would think of as shamanic work. And so it is very much about, like, in the moment, spiritual, getting to your spiritual self and center and working on that very directly, that I've had those experiences arise.
Yeah, so back to what you were saying before I asked about the meditation thing. So you were interested in the shamanism from, you said 7, 8 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and you knew the word somehow, right? Like you knew what a shaman was at some level, and then
Yeah.
so that took you into, if you were going to just like explain like that, like what it was that led you to that, and so just like whatever
Sure.
your beginning was in there.
That's a good question. I'm not quite sure that I know where I first heard that term or was exposed to that kind of idea that it was possible, to have this direct relationship with spirit. I think the way that shamans do. I think it was probably, looking at old books about Native American history or South American history. Maybe it came in part because my aunt was, she lived in Peru with her husband for a while, and maybe they brought some of those images and ideas back with them. But just the idea of the shaman as this like spiritual, like they can take animal forms, they talk to animals, talk to plants, they can heal you with spirit, they wear these crazy looking furs and stuff to make them look different. I don't know, it just seems so intriguing, I think, to some degree. It's like, wow, that's far out. I'm attracted to that. And so for whatever reason, I was just kind of drawn to that image of it, I think, initially. And then, I could investigate that a little bit on what those roots are in me. But I remember my aunt asking me early on, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And saying, I want to be a shaman. And, she worked a lot with Hmong populations that were resettling here in the United States. And she had she told me at that time that her daycare, her babysitter basically for my cousin, was a traditional shaman from their culture that had moved here and was very much displaced. And so maybe there's something there from the family history. I grew up in a family, again, kind of tinkerers and whatnot, but I did grow up close to nature. My dad and grandpa took me out fishing and hunting mushrooms and hunting animals and creek stomping and eating crayfish and all kinds of stuff from an early age, and it's just been part of me, that connection to nature. So, yeah.
So did you go to a formal school for herbalism? Like I was talking with Carter, who studied under you. Carter, at the time, he's like 16, 17. At the time, he was like 15. And I had really sore ribs from jiu-jitsu class. I got my ribs hurt somehow. And he's like, oh, you need some... I forget what it was. I'll probably think of it in a minute. But then he goes, we were here at White Pine. That's where we're recording now. And he started like looking around for it. And he was like, oh, it's not flowering now, but you can like, kind of look around for it. And I was like, comfrey? Mm-hmm. Is that it? Is that right? And he was telling me about it. And he's like, if the bone's broke though, that might not be good because it'll heal it too fast. And And I'm like, so what is it in there? And he's breaking down the chemicals by name, and like this kid is 15, and he's blowing me away. He's really sharp young man. And so did you go to like college for this, or was it just all self-study or different teachers along the way?
So I started out as, it was like, I don't know, 13, 14, started having recurrent strep throat infections. And I found in one of my grandpa's books on kitchen home remedies about using pineapple to kill strep throat, basically. And I had gone and gotten antibiotics a number of times that year, and they were not effective. It just kept coming back. And so I found this home remedy. I used pineapple. It went away, and it stayed away. And it was just a very powerful experience for me. So that was kind of my first introduction to the idea that a plant or food could help heal a disease that you might otherwise need a prescription for, that could threaten your life. It was very powerful for me. And so I started really getting interested in nutrition specifically, and functional foods, or like healing foods and their properties. And started working more like in health food stores as an adult, where I had who I consider my first teacher is Dr. Thor Connor. He's a physician up in Chicago now, a naturopathic physician. And he was not a physician at the time. He was my boss at the health food store in the supplement department, like the natural living area. And his wife was, though, already a naturopathic doctor. She's also has a doctor of Oriental medicine now. She also teaches up in Chicago. Anyway, wonderful, brilliant people. Thor sort of took me under his wing a little bit and helped to share the stuff that he had learned from Christina, and taught me a lot about nutrition and herbalism, using herbs, I would say. And then, so I worked in health food stores. I got promoted and moved out to California with that, where I met my first herbalist I'd ever met. So she was a product rep for a company whose products I sold and often recommended, great company. And she just knew more about the plants and where they came from and how they were prepared traditionally, and if they were used raw or dried, and what you had to do to dry them if they needed it, and what kind of offerings might have been traditionally made for these plants. And it just blew me away that she had all of this context and connection for where these things came from, that these were natural things. Whereas I was working from a place where I'm looking at a row of 100 different little tincture bottles that all look the same. The only thing that is different on any of them is just the name of the plant that's in there. And that's as much insight as I had into those plants at that time, besides those that I had tasted and used. And a few, that I was familiar with from gardening and my, limited amount of study in the wild at that point. So I was just blown away with her knowledge. Her name is Shay. And I started asking her questions about it. Where did you learn this stuff? And she had studied with a traditional herbalist here in the United States in New York State named Seven Song. And she had also studied in, I think, the Philippines or Indonesia with a more traditional, indigenous healer there. Seven Song was my first teacher, so I went to meet him the next year and quit my job in California and went to his school for like full-time study, essentially. And it was a 7-month program that I did with him, that he taught me and the other students how to identify plants with a more rigorous approach to that study than most herbalists get, which I'm really thankful for now. He taught me how to make plant medicines with, using alcohol as an extractive. He was making good oil infusions, and how to understand people and how their bodies are working and the qualities of the plants to be able to put them together in a functional way, in a very different way than just the tradition, the sort of this for that approach, which is a drug model. And so that's how most people are taking herbs today, is still this kind of allopathic approach of it's a this for that sort of thing. Oh, I've got a cold coming on. I'll take some echinacea. It's not traditionally how echinacea is used at all. So is it effective? Well, often not. if we use it more in line with the traditional context, it is pretty effective.
What is that?
It's traditionally echinacea is traditionally used more in deeper seated infections where there's a toxic element, and it's the detoxifying quality of it, that neutralizing quality almost of the infection's toxicity that enables it, helps enable your body to then clean up the infection, get it out of there. Case in point is staph. Staph makes a lot of toxins that it exudes out to break down your tissue so that it can then feed on that. Bacteria don't have a stomach internally, it's all on the outside for them. So they secrete their digestive fluids out into the environment, breaking down what's around them, and then taking it back in. Well, for us, those are toxins. For us, those are breaking down our cells and opening them up so that the bacteria can digest them. So when you have a staph infection, that's constantly happening. So if you can't stop the toxic breakdown of your tissue, then it's really difficult to get a handle on the infection and be able to heal it up. And if your tissue is constantly being degraded by toxins, then it's really hard to get white blood cells there effectively. So echinacea is traditionally used more for deep-seated infections rather than like viral cold and flu. Something more bacterial or fungal is typical.
And so it was Seven Song that kind of introduced you to the not the this for that approach.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you get in like more of like how he was showing you that and like how that began to make sense for you?
Sure. The approach that he taught me really was kind of through the lens of Ayurveda, the traditional system of medicine for India.
I was just about to ask you about Ayurveda. That was my next question.
Okay, cool. So Seven Song had lived in India for a while, traveling there, and he had, I think, contracted a case of hepatitis B, which is, a treatable type of hepatitis, unlike Hep C. And he received Ayurvedic treatment, I think, for that or after that, and it was influential on him. And so he had learned about it a bit there, and he learned about it in his experience, in his study. He spent a lot more time studying herbalism than I have at this point, but anyway, he taught us about using the doshas in Ayurveda. So that's kind of like the body types people have and their combinations and how they manifest in the body, to be able to then get some idea about what somebody's strengths and weaknesses are physiologically based on what type of body they have. And there's good physical chemical type arguments that you can make for these things, but it's not considered a scientific approach. It's what I think of as more like the art of medicine, where you can kind of tailor things. So in that approach, different types of bodies have different types of energy that we're made up of, and then that kind of helps to understand the underlying patterns of what's going on when their bodies are out of balance, and then what plants really would make sense based on their qualities and how they interact with the elements to then help restore balance in a person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, what reminded me of to ask about Ayurveda was you were saying like the drying and so if you have this so that would be like would that be like vata, or that would be like more so you have like this kapha condition and then you're treating it with vata. Is that what the echinacea is doing? Is that
sort of? Yeah. What I would say there is, so let's say you have an infection that's somewhat chronic, so you're a little bit, it's not super inflamed at this point, but it's weeping a lot, but not necessarily angry and red, so you have this kind of kapha type weepiness, this fluids. Kapha is characterized by dampness or fluids, sometimes stagnation or a gravitational energy. So then you would apply, in this case, I would say a vata increasing herb rather than necessarily a vata herb. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that the herb has that quality per se, but it would increase or change those qualities in us, those doshas in us. So it's just a small terminological thing, a way we use those terms.
That makes sense.
And I don't know that the way that I use those terms is at all in line with traditional Ayurveda. It's highly unlikely. And I have to acknowledge that I am very much a Western mongrel practitioner and pick and choose what works for me. and integrate a lot of different things from Ayurveda, from Chinese medicine, Native American medicine, and Western European medicine too.
So when you're like when you're out and maybe you're in an area that you haven't been before, and you're looking at the plants, if you see a plant and you don't know what it is, can you just like figure it out by the way it looks, or does the plant, like the spirit of it, like talk to you and say, "Hey, I'm for this," and then you go home and Google it and you're right, or something like that? Do those kind of things happen after a while?
That sounds really magical and romantic. I wish that kind of thing happened, but no. Typically, so I guess if I'm in a new environment, meeting a new plant, and I don't know who it is, I don't know its name or who it is, if I feel called to it, I almost always touch it, which can be a little bit risky. Usually it's okay to just touch plants, but there was one case very much like this that's coming to mind up in northern Indiana in a kind of wet, sandy environment. And this plant occurs occasionally around here, but it's not common in central Indiana. And it only really occurs in swamps and boggy type areas. Not really bogs, swamps, fens, and those kind of wetland environments. So here's this plant, and it's kind of in the corner of this open field where it's mostly cattail swamp. There's blackberry and hazelnut and other plants in here, and buttonbush and elderberry. And then there's this tree line kind of around the back of this property. And along the tree line, in the corner of the thing, is this beautiful orange and red foliaged shrub. It's fall, so it's just really standing out in its peak color in this particular time. It's the only member of its kind in my eyesight. I can look around, and in that time of year, you can really just look around and tell if there's other plants because they all have the same kind of color that stands out at that time. And it's the only one there, so I say, "Gosh, aren't you beautiful?" And it's just waving around in the breeze, which is kind of a sign maybe this plant's trying to talk to you. So I think I better get a closer look here. And so I approach the plant, and it's just presenting itself right here for me in such a way I just feel compelled to just put my hand right on it. And as soon as my hand touches it, I feel, oh yeah, I know this plant. And it was like made that contact with me of like, you remember me now. And it was poison sumac.
Uh-oh.
And like its cousin poison ivy, poison sumac's medicine is in plant awareness. It's that if you're not aware of the plants in your area, they're going to make you aware. These plants are going to wake you up and make you start to look at the plants in your environment. So that was a moment of like kind of emergency, like, what do I do? Because I am highly allergic to poison ivy and poison sumac. So I, was like, oh, nice to see you again. Thanks for the reminder. I'll remember your name next time. That's kind of the feeling I had. It was like, don't forget me.
So is the treatment for these plants nearby? Do they tend to grow together? I noticed like when I was out in the woods with my girlfriend a week or two ago, and everything is just still like not a lot of leaves, but the thorns they're red. So when you're walking through, you can see red. And it's like, okay, those are thorns. I can tell from way far away, even though I can't see the thorn. But anyways, so it is like the treatment for the poison sumac nearby, or what do you do?
Well, I know, from my scientific knowledge about urushiol, the chemical that's in those plants, that it takes about an hour to really bind the receptor sites in your skin, where it then causes this autoimmune type rash and tissue degeneration. I know that I've got about 15 minutes of time to wash it off with soap, and you can remove the oils with soap before they absorb. And so that was my first thought, is where can I wash my hands? Where can I find soap? I start thinking about soapwort, about yucca, and other plants that bear soap. If I had buckeyes around, I could mix them into a lather and get it off my hands. I didn't have those things available, so I just put my hands in some soil, and I feel like just the earth and just putting your hands in the earth or putting your hands in water can be a healing experience. Coming in that close contact with those elements in their pure form. Anyway, I just kind of brushed that off of there. I think what you're kind of hinting at with the is there a plant that grows nearby is the common idea of jewelweed, which is a remedy for poison ivy. Growing, side by side poison ivy, a lot of people talk about this, and it's common. It's not uncommon for those plants to grow side by side. Jewelweed is a very common plant. It likes wet forest soils. I've seen it where it was the dominant plant through acres and acres of forest in the right conditions that year or whatever. It's an annual plant, so it can kind of have these fluctuations a little bit of whether it has good years and bad years. And it is, chemically contains a constituent called lawsone that will block the same receptor sites that the urushiol in the poison ivy and sumac would, affect your skin. So it can effectively block those, and that's a direct chemical remedy for it. But there's a lot of other things that you can put on it. So any astringent type plant could help dry up those oils and tighten up your tissue to make you less sensitive to getting those oils in there. And, 15 to 25% of people are not allergic to poison ivy at all and just don't react to it. So those people are lucky; they don't even have to worry about it. But what I've really found, I don't think that they naturally grow right next to each other. Although there is something to plant communities and them growing side by side and living in community together. But I think that in my experience learning about foraging and herbal medicine, when you walk outside, there is just food and medicine every footstep that you take. You're passing food and medicine everywhere you go, and it's just a matter of having the eyes to see it and the understanding and knowledge of the plants to know. And so I think if you have that knowledge, you get poison ivy or whatever else, you've got medicine nearby almost always.
Yeah, you just reminded me of talking about how nearby everything is, and we've taught at the same workshop before where at White Pine there was a bunch of different teachers teaching different stuff. You were doing the herbs, I was doing kettlebells, and it wasn't like when it was at your class we went to some exotic location. We were already there. You're in the yard, and here's the plants. And I think we walked across the street and to the park, and so it is interesting the disconnect that people have between or they'll pay the lawn care company $50 to come out and spray their weeds, and then they go to Whole Foods or something, and then they'll get some dandelion tea, and it's like, why did you just pay $5 for dandelion tea when you could have saved $50 and just got the dandelions out of your yard? But if there was a place for people to start, they hear this, and it can be overwhelming. Okay, well, here's a 5 encyclopedias of plants to learn. Is there what's the simple way for somebody to start, or if they're interested in the plant consciousness, or what's a good place to begin?
Good questions. Yeah, I mean, there's probably globally at least tens of thousands of plants, 80,000, 100,000 plants that you could use for medicine. Many more that are food plants. In our own home environment here in Indiana, where I believe we have about 5,000 to 6,000 species of plants that grow here. Easily 1,000 of those are medicinal plants. I don't know those
1,000?
Easily, if not more. Almost all plants have some medicinal use of some kind, so I would put that number even higher. But at least 1,000 local plants that are native here, or grow in the wild here. That would include the non-natives like dandelion and chicory and their relatives, but their ilk, I'll say. So yeah, where to start can be very complex. In my practice, I use at least several hundred plants regularly, but there are probably only 24 that make up probably 90 to 95% of the medicines that I recommend to people. So there are a lot of plants that are incredibly useful in a lot of ways, that are sort of flexible in their uses or are supportive and nutritive in their medicine to where they can help a lot of different people for a lot of different conditions. And a lot of them are food plants, wild food plants that we would have traditionally been eating as a regular part of our peasant diet before we all became essentially royalty in our access to nutrition. So we have all these diseases of affluence, people call it, and just getting back to a more simple way of life and eating the weeds in your yard instead of paying ChemLawn to come kill them for you is a simple step you can take to connecting with nature and eating your medicine and also taking care of your lawn. So there's just so many ways it integrates in your lifestyle. But a few simple plants I would start out with just to get to know. Dandelion is one of those. Dandelions, which are blooming now, there was one blooming in my yard this morning. I think of it as sort of the bison of the plant world, where you can use the whole plant for food or medicine in some way if you just know how. And so starting at the top, you've got the yellow flower head on the dandelion, which is really a cluster of about 100 flowers. You can take just the petals out of those if you'd like, get it out of the green receptacle, and they will have really no bitter flavor at all. So if you're someone who really just is turned off by the bitter flavor that dandelion does have and all the green parts of its plant, give those little yellow parts a shot. They have a lot of nutrients that help support your brain and liver function, so it's good stuff to get. I've taken those and put like a couple cups into a batch of muffins or cookies, and it's super easy to integrate them into something that your whole family will like, and tastes good and is colorful and adds that wild plant medicine to it.
What's in it that's beneficial? What's the medicine in it?
It's high in lecithin, and also probably astaxanthin and other yellow, carotenoids that help your eyes and nervous system tissue. But the lecithin it emulsifies oil into water, so that helps with digestion of fats and fat metabolism more generally in the liver. But for your brain, lecithin is a source of precursors for certain neurotransmitters like phosphatidylcholine, acetylcholine, phosphatidylserine, and other neurotransmitter precursors that can be protective for your brain in the long term. So there's been some association of getting those in the diet and reduced incidence or severity of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease.
Well, that was a lot more than I was expecting out of it.
and that's just the flowers, So you've got the seeds. Once they go to seed and they have the little puffy white things, you can take the little seed cluster and pop it off of there and just nibble that little cluster of seeds. It's like just a little bite of protein and energy. The stem on the flowering stalk, when they get long in the summertime, you can harvest those and boil them up as a gluten-free pasta alternative. It only takes 1 or 2 minutes in boiling water and they're cooked. They're hollow, so they kind of hold on to the sauce well. It's kind of fun. The leaves are a great salad green or cooked green. They are bitter, like I said before, but a lot of us need bitters. Herbalists recommend...
It's another Ayurveda thing.
In the West here, where we eat almost no bitter foods, it's really difficult for people to get around that flavor. But herbalists will recommend the bitter flavor to about 85% of clients in the West because we need them, because they're missing from our diet. If you're someone who craves coffee or beer, you're probably craving that bitter flavor for a physiological reason. And bitters are an interesting... we keep going a lot of different directions here, but bitter is an interesting flavor in that just the flavor on your tongue stimulates a lot of processes in your body. So outside of the specific chemistry of whether they're alkaloids or glucosides or what is bitter in there and how those specific chemicals interact in the body, just the taste of bitter, anything, has a physiological effect. And that primes your body for digestion. It increases detoxification rate. It basically is saying to your body, hey, there could be something toxic coming in here. Let's get ready for this and let's get all the gears going to get it out of the body and neutralize it. And if you're not dealing with toxins, then you're cleaning up your body. and you're digesting your foods better. So a lot of people will take bitters before foods to help prime everything up and get everything going before you eat. You'll absorb the food better. It'll digest more completely. You'll get less cramping and gas and bloating because you have less fermentation going on in there. It's a win for everybody.
Is coffee considered a bitter that does that?
Yeah, coffee is bitter. It does that. And I think a lot of people crave coffee not for the stimulation, but for the digestive stimulation. A lot of people need help going to the bathroom when they first get up in the morning, and that taste of bitter can get you going right away.
Interesting that you say that's the taste of it that does that. That's not particularly why I drink it, but I'm drinking my coffee now. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'll probably have another cup of coffee later. I like it kind of all day. I can drink it before I go to sleep, and I don't do it to help me like wake up in the morning, like because like the caffeine, I think it just helps me like get going. Like it can help me like calm down. It can help me like get ready. It can help me with a lot. But yeah, I guess I didn't think of it as a bitter like in the same way like the Ayurveda. You need bitters for this. I was thinking. I guess I never really thought of it like that. Mm-hmm. And so it's just the taste of it gets all those processes going.
Well, and it is also a physical stimulant where it's going to stimulate heart rate, breathing, physical motility, those kind of things too. So it has, again, like there's the specific chemistry of the alkaloids in this case that are bitter, and then there's the more generalized action of the bitter flavor. So I would describe some of what you're saying to the bitter flavor and some of it to the more specific nature of those alkaloids. But you seem like, I don't know you too well, I haven't done a physical assessment with you, but you seem to have, predominantly a Pitta and Kapha type constitution, just from looking at you. And so, the way that bitters would serve you specifically is that by increasing digestion and detoxification and liver function, it's a very cooling flavor. Bitter's considered traditionally the most cooling of the flavors. So that can bring down excess heat in Pitta type people or fire type nature. And then all of those processes of increasing motion through the digestive tract can help with breaking up stagnation for Kapha. So those are
so the motion is that you're talking. So that's Vata, or are you
increasing motion is considered a Vata energy. Yes, movement is a Vata principle.
Yeah,
but to use movement to break up stagnation from Kapha. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I would describe myself as quite Pitta. Pitta means like fiery, heat.
You can't see him, but he has a red beard, and that's almost always a sign of strong Pitta energy.
Oh, interesting.
What kind of
like the rest of my hair is like all brown, but yeah, for some reason my beard it's like Viking blood. Coursing through my veins and poking out my face. But what you're saying is because like some of the stuff in Ayurveda confused me because, so if you're like this Pitta person, they might say you need like these more relaxing workouts. You got to mellow out, man. Like just do yoga, which I do yoga too. But I also like think that like if you're a Pitta person and you have this energy that you need to get out, you have to express it. So I like these explosive, powerful workouts. I like martial arts and sparring and I do the yoga too, so I have like all of that. But with the coffee and the bitters are these so you're saying that coffee for me, which is a stimulant, could actually have could actually have a cooling effect on me? Would it or am I wrong? Or and maybe if someone else was Vata, it would have a Pitta effect on them? Or am I...
Good questions here. You're getting a little nuanced, but what I would say is the bitter flavor is appropriate for you, maybe as a Pitta dominant individual. I'm not sure coffee is the best bitter for you. Because it does tend to increase Pitta nature a little bit in terms of especially the more psychological expressions of anger or irritability is a common thing with Pitta, restlessness, and it can increase those things. I agree with you completely, though, that it is completely appropriate for a Pitta nature person to be getting vigorous physical activity, and that can really help balance that constitution, I think. You don't want to excessively increase inflammation. And I think it is important to have the mindfulness practices too. But I agree with you completely. Like, sometimes I'm also a pitta dominant person, and when I get out of whack and I start getting liver stagnation and the heat starts to go to my head and I start to get angry and I start to lose my patience, and I have a very physical reaction in that moment. I feel highly adrenalized where I need to get that adrenaline out. I need to work that out in some way. And so going to split some wood or going to take a long walk or whatever, doing demolition on something in my house, like whatever I can do to get a strong physical response, that can really help bring me into balance. And I think that's true for a lot of pitta nature people. And suppressing that does the complete opposite. So, yeah. I mean, if you're a monk and you can put your whole life around eating with very close intention and not provoking the pitta and bringing it in balance with mindfulness practices, that's great. That's not practical for most of us, though, in everyday life, because we are dealing with a lot of outside energies and stuff that trickles in that can increase our pitta. And in our culture, we have a culture and society that selects for pitta. So we're encouraged to be pitta, and that makes our weaknesses exacerbated.
What do you mean by that? We're encouraged to be pitta?
Pitta people are those who tend to excel in business environments, especially. So pitta people tend to have sharp minds. They tend to be decisive. They tend to be good at manipulating others. I'm not saying any of this about you or me personally. These are generalities. Pitta-natured people are usually smart. They're highly motivated. They're driven and ambitious people. And those are all things that we tend to desire in business, compared to, let's say, a more Vata-natured person whose mind might work more in images and they might have more of the artist mind a little bit rather than like the practical engineer mind of the pitta. The Vata-natured person tends to be a little bit more scattered, a little less focused.
Vata or pitta?
Excuse me, Vata. Did I say pitta?
I just want to make sure I heard you correctly.
Okay. Yeah. So the Vata-natured person tends to be a little bit more distracted, a little less grounded, a little more energy up in the spiritual, intuitive realm. And so then in conflict in a business setting, they tend to withdraw. They tend to move on to a different job, or they don't usually have as much ambition, and they don't have a lot of physical stamina typically because they're a kind of sparse physical structure. So they aren't usually the most like productive workers in a team. But if you can direct their energy in a way that they're able to be creative and you really capitalize on that, they can be really valuable. It's just having that knowledge of where people are. If you expect a Vata nature person to be as productive, or so when we have these like performance based initiatives in a corporate environment, and you're pitting pitta against Vata, it's just not apples to apples, in my opinion. So in that way we incentivize pitta. Anybody that's able to get those performance bonuses is probably pitta dominant, or at least a significant part pitta. Your more kapha nature people tend to have the greatest strength and endurance, the greatest resilience, but they tend again towards kind of sluggishness or stagnation as a weakness. So that can be intermittent productivity. They can be really great. They can be the tortoise in the race. They're going to get there. They're going to stick with it. They're not going to wear out like a pitta person can. Pitta people, one of our weaknesses tends to be exhausting our physical bodies because our minds are so driven that we'll go past our physical boundaries to the breaking point. So we can drive ourselves towards becoming ill or fatigued, or towards having an injury, or even repetitive use injury is usually a sign of pitta nature.
Yeah, what that was just kind of reminded me of was I'm a strength and conditioning instructor, and so looking at some stuff from the Ayurveda point of view, it was like, the kapha, they have like these physical gifts potentially, but then they don't really feel like doing it. They're naturally strong, but they don't really maybe not feel like, where the pitta is like, I'm going after it, and then the vata may be more inclined to maybe like more the yoga, where maybe more the explosive stuff may be more helpful. But what I was just thinking was, like, you're talking about the business world. So my girlfriend works for Roche, and she's what was I saying? Oh, well, she took this kind of like a personality test. It was something like the Myers-Briggs, I think. But like this thing, she sent it to me. It was like 50 pages long, and so I was just wondering if, and it says what you're good at and what maybe you could work on and all of that. And I was just thinking, like, part of that could be classified as like a dosha test, but I was just wondering if it could be like pointed out that way, or something like that, like the Ayurvedic perspective on it, instead of just these more like Western terms. If you could somehow look at, like, yeah, I mean, I just thought of this. I don't have it really well thought out, but like, yeah, so you have like this Pitta person. Maybe we can kind of like tell, yeah, he's this go-getter, and then this other guy is the Kapha guy. Maybe put him somewhere where he doesn't have to be so dynamic, but just steady. Do you know of anything like that? I don't even know how to ask the question, because I just thought of it.
No, that's a good. You're on a good line of thought here, and there is actually a traditional system that is derived from ancient Greek medicine that is still used somewhat for personality typing, even like to the point of like marriage counseling, like premarital counseling to see if you're a good partner. Like the Myers-Briggs test could be used kind of for that. I took that with a premarital counselor before I got married, and with my partner. But I think it's used particularly in Catholicism, although I'm not Catholic, so I can't speak to that directly. But it's known as the humoral temperaments. And there are 4 traditional humoral temperaments, and if you've ever heard of, balancing the humors, that sort of concept of like bloodletting and getting fluids in balance in the body, that's the same tradition. So it's based on, the traditional medical philosophy of Aristotle and of other, like Hippocrates, I believe, is part of this tradition. And it goes way further back. It's really, the roots of that go back into Egyptian and maybe even Yoruban medicine in Africa, more of a Western African tradition there. So it goes way back. But this is the traditional kind of European lineage of this traditional medicine, is the humoral approach. So I learned this approach. I studied with an herbalist named Jim McDonald in Michigan in 2013 to learn more about this particularly, and understand energetics better in the body and how they manifest, how they're best treated, and that sort of thing. And Jim's a great teacher for that. So they have more of a four humor model. So you have phlegmatic, which is associated with the fluid phlegm, but you could sort of loosely associate that with Kapha in Ayurveda. It's a more gravitational energy, but it's damp. It tends to be, kind of the way you can think about it is whether these are more socially oriented or individually oriented types, and more introverted or extroverted manifestations of that. So the phlegmatic type tends to be socially oriented, where they are really concerned about other people, but they tend to be somewhat of an introvert. So they tend to be like your warriors, your Piglet, and Winnie the Pooh. They're worried about other people, and they're keeping track of where everybody's at, but they're not necessarily like the life of the party, because they're kind of introverted, and they kind of will take the back seat in that role, but they are very socially motivated to know what everybody's doing, where everybody's at. Then kind of moving around to melancholic temperament is more earth energy. It's associated with black bile, which isn't really a proper fluid in the body. That's kind of most correlated with lymph and our understanding of lymph, which they didn't have an understanding of that fluid in those times. It's thought of being related to toxicity and a toxic load. Those people tend to be of large, substantial frames, but not necessarily heavy in weight. They tend to be kind of big earth bone type people. They have, the melancholic temperament is, we kind of think of that as the philosopher. They're highly cerebral, but kind of negative maybe a little bit, or the cynical approach. And that can be their weakness and their strength. And then, they're tended towards dryness again. So then you can kind of move around to the choleric temperament, which is yellow bile, is what it's associated with, which is more like a true liver, hepatic bile. And that's most closely associated with pitta in Ayurveda. There's a close analogy between the two. So it's kind of a fire principle. They tend towards inflammation, towards anger, towards social mobility and upward mobility particularly. And they are individually oriented and extroverted. Your melancholic person is individually oriented and introverted. Then the last type is your sanguine-natured person, who is an extroverted, socially oriented person. And they are represented by the element of blood. And you can kind of think of these types as being people who are motivated towards excesses of all kinds. Excess alcohol, excess food, excess women, excess partying, excess late nights, excess whatever in their life. They tend to live it towards excess. They're also usually a lot of fun. Personality-wise, they're usually funny. They love being around other people. They're energized by being around other people, and they're really good at that, and they're in their element there. They tend to have red cheeks and kind of more round features a little bit, again, being kind of full. That's kind of the picture there. So that's, I don't use that as much as I use the tridoshic sort of model from Ayurveda in my work, but sometimes it comes in handy if somebody doesn't fit the kapha of Ayurveda very well, but they are a solid melancholic or sanguine-natured person, then it can be easier to work within that pattern for me. So that's kind of where I tend to fall with that. But like your pitta and choleric are pretty darn close. Your phlegmatic and kapha are pretty darn close. There's some elements of the melancholic in the kapha. There's some elements of the melancholic even in the pitta. But there's elements of vata in the sanguine, and it's complicated. They don't lay over each other very well. But one thing that Jim was really good at as a teacher is associating these different elements and physiological patterns with their tissue state correlates, which is like whether a tissue's dry or hot or cold or wet or excessively relaxed or tense. And those are kind of the 6 tissue states we traditionally use. And those fit into both models pretty well to be able to see kind of where they line up or make sense.
Yeah, I was just watching some videos on Jordan Peterson. He's a psychologist, and but he was talking about how, like for some of his patients, he'll use like the Jungian approach. Mm-hmm. For somebody else that doesn't work, he has to use Freud. Mm-hmm. So that's what that just kind of reminded me of. So what you're saying is you have, like, somebody will come in and they fit this Ayurvedic approach will work good. And then somebody mm-hmm. comes in and it's like, Ayurveda doesn't match up right here. So you're mm-hmm. just going to use this other system. And so you can kind of like match the system to the client.
Yeah. It's a lot like having different tools in your toolkit that you can get out depending on the job. And you might be able to do any job with a handsaw, but there's some situations where it's really nice to have a power saw or a table saw, just use that analogy. So I look at it very much like that. I think I'm most comfortable with the tridoshic system because I've been using it the longest, having learned that from Seven Song. We spent a lot of time, to practice that. We'd spend a lot of time like sitting in public places, watching people walk around and talking about what doshas they have based on how they walk, what their voice sounded like, what their body looks like, where they hold weight in their body, whether their balance is forward or is back on their heels a little bit. All these things can tell you little inferences about the predominance of any of these doshas or energies in their body. And of course we all have all of these energies in some mixed proportion. So sometimes people just don't fit any of these patterns, and you got to just kind of scrap all that and just listen to them and find out, and try to go just more directly to the plants. And that's okay too. So, like I'm not usually going to do a constitutional assessment in a first aid application as much as I am somebody with chronic long-term diseases, because those are usually more seated in that constitutional element.
So when you're looking at these different routes to take. Do you have like back to the plant consciousness part, are there plants that kind of almost like, hey, pick me, or like how do you use like the plant consciousness in your practice? I don't really quite know the exact question to ask, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. There are times when I'm sitting with someone or talking with someone, whether that's a formal clinical time that I've got where I'm doing a consultation with somebody, or that can just sometimes be I'm looking at somebody on the street and it'll feel like somebody's in your head talking to you. And it's I think that it's some part of this greater connectivity we have in consciousness that we don't quite understand yet, but that pretty much all religious and spiritual traditions point to in some way or another. And it'll, I get this like, that person needs yarrow, or give them me. They need my flowers, and it's like the plant will just kind of drop these little messages in there, and it's very direct for me in that way. But then, when you look at traditional Native American stuff, especially, they look at like the plant trying to get your attention by moving in some way, or seeming to, like I had mentioned about sumac, kind of blowing around a little more than the other plants in the area, and it just kind of seemed like it was waving around trying to talk to me a little bit. And that seems maybe far-fetched, but the truth is, like, plants do move. Plants, it happens in a time scale that we just don't perceive. So you have to use time-lapse photography to be able to really perceive it, but it's a very intentional movement that they have, and it has to do, they grow their cells in length, and they can grow one side of the cell longer than the other to bend that tissue in there. And it's the same proteins that are in our muscles are in those cells, those plant cells, that are responsible for that contraction and moving. The physiological parallels are, we're learning more and more about how similar we are to plants. There's an interesting story that I think is really powerful about this herbalist named David Winston, and he has a school and a practice out in New Jersey. He's a brilliant herbalist, and he's been foundational in establishing the American Herbalist Guild and the United Plant Savers, two organizations I have a lot of respect for in our practice. And he is of Native American descent in part, and practices traditional Cherokee medicine. And he was working with a number of clients. This is a secondhand telling the story. I haven't heard this directly from David, but this is a secondhand account that I heard from Jim McDonald. And he said, so I may get a couple things not quite completely accurate, so if you're listening to this and you've heard the story differently, forgive me. But David's, out on his deck or in his backyard, and he's thinking about these clients that he's had, these patients who are all on dialysis, which is, based on damaged kidneys in the West. That's sort of like it's just a palliative thing to go get dialysis, to have your, blood filtered. It's critical for life, but it doesn't help heal your kidneys at all. And there's not really much that anybody knows that you can do to heal your kidneys once they're impaired. So David's meditating on this conundrum that we all have. And as he's standing there, it's a slow, gentle wind kind of day, and over in a corner of his garden, furiously flapping around and moving in the wind, even though there wasn't any wind, is this stinging nettles plant, this classic, food and medicine plant that we've used in the West and in America for a long time. It's known to be a kidney tonic, and it starts talking to David and saying, he tunes in, with whatever meditative thing that he does to be able to tune in and listen to the plants. And this is just what you have to do. It's just, if you just center yourself and put your energy center sort of in your heart, and you try to listen from your heart, the plants, it's easier for them to talk to you. It's easier for you to hear, I should say. They're talking to you all the time. It's just that we aren't listening. Anyway, so the plant starts talking to him, and it says, basically, use my seeds. Give your patients my seeds. It will help their kidneys. And, the leaves have been used traditionally, and they're known to be a kidney tonic and a diuretic, but nobody's used the seeds. Nobody messes with that. People eat them. sometimes, and it goes great on salads, but it's not something that people have thought about using as a medicine as far as I've ever known. And so he's going, okay, try your seeds for my dialysis patients. Okay. So he starts to get the plan in motion here a little bit, and he takes it to heart. He's listening to the plant, and he, in the right season, gathers the seeds, and he or gets them from somebody else getting them in season, and he starts to give them to his clients. And slowly but surely, his dialysis clients start improving in their condition. Their function gets better. Their kidney panels are getting better. Their blood tests are getting better. And pretty soon, he's got people getting off of dialysis. And it's been multiple clients now. The word has spread. It's a very powerful thing for herbalism. It's something I just brought up in one of my classes and talking about this in the context of the plant nettles. And I had a nurse in there who was had just retired, I think, from she was a dialysis nurse for her whole profession, and she was just floored that this is something that herbalists are learning and nobody seems to know or pay any attention to in the scientific community or the larger medical community. And I'm sure that people have heard these stories. Do they take them seriously? I doubt it, honestly. There's a lot of stuff wrapped up in maintaining the status quo in medicine, and has been for a long time. It goes back way longer than even drugs go. It goes back all the way to where, kind of in Europe, we started to separate out spices and foods, and we eventually started to separate out medicines from doctors, and created this somewhat of a disconnect, which is it's all for good intentions, but it creates this disconnect of food as being our medicine, and of ourselves being able to help with our own health, and having that power, and taking that power away from us in some way. For a long time, all the herbal books were written in Latin, which made them inaccessible to the layperson. So then you had to go pay somebody, the steep price to get healing, because you couldn't just read the book and find out for yourself. That was, and so that's kind of where some of that stuff started. And we've always had folk herbalists, and we've always had professional herbalists, kind of in that context. And, to me, the folk traditions really stand out because of their connection to nature and spirit. And to me, that's really important and valuable. And the more I listen to it, the better a healer I am.
Yeah, that's really cool. I hadn't heard about the dialysis thing before. I used to drive a cab, and a lot of what I did was medical transportation, and it is crazy how many people are on dialysis. And I would see the same people day after day. They have to go in. It's like every 3 days or every couple, something like that. And it's like an all day thing. I mean, that's what they do for the day, and it wipes them out. And so it would be interesting to see, if they could have, implement these other things in there too. And I think a lot of the problem is money, because there's probably not a lot of money in the stinging nettle business. Mm-hmm. And, so the pharmaceutical companies want to extract something that they can have a patent on and make a lot of money. And pharmaceutical companies have saved a lot of lives for sure. Mm-hmm. But I think there's also not all of them have the best intentions when they have money to make. But my dad had cancer, and he died in 2005. But when he got it, he started looking into a lot of natural remedies, and he came across this woman named Renee Case. Mm-hmm. And she got called the cure for cancer from the Ojibwa Indians, and it was just a bunch of stuff that you'd find in your backyard, and then there was places that sold that mixture of herbs, and it was like $12 for a month's supply or something like that. So it's not like these crazy prices. Mm-hmm. And so my dad was doing that, and I think he eventually kind of got off of it. But it's like this thing of, well, who do you trust? And there's different kinds of cancer. What does it mean? And is it really, can you say it's a cure? And that,
Mm-hmm.
but it would be nice if there was a little more, and maybe it's happening, maybe it is happening, but not fast enough. This blend of Western science has done a lot. These pharmaceutical companies are saving lives for sure, but there's these ancient ways that, the plants talking to you, and maybe that's how people before we had, like the books that say like what plant is for what, and you're going through and the plants are talking to you, and just because people knew how to listen, then like, hey, I'm over here, I'm for this, and
then we tell those stories, and that oral tradition spreads and goes down through the generations. And I think that very much that's part of the origin of our knowledge, and something that we've lost a tremendous amount of in the United States, especially. Thankfully, a lot of those traditions are still there around the world, but as we're losing indigenous communities and indigenous cultures, they're becoming extinct, essentially. Where we have literally a handful of hunter-gatherer societies and cultures left on our planet, when that was everybody 15,000 years ago. And that all that knowledge is, it's eroding, essentially, just along with like the varieties of seeds we have and vegetables, and there's a tremendous amount of loss due to commercialization. And it's absolutely true. There's not a lot of economical incentive to go through the kind of drug testing that would be needed for most herbs to be able to be, to meet the standards demanded by doctors and drug companies and the FDA to be approved as a drug. There's just not. It just doesn't add up money wise. It's just not possible. But I think the actual practice and traditions of herbalism are a lot closer to our culinary traditions in what they look like and smell like and feel like. When you're working and making crude plant extracts, you're working with vegetables. You're not working with little isolates and Erlenmeyer flasks and Bunsen burners and stuff. It's not a lab environment. And so I think if we made it a little more distinct from our conventional medicine and kept it a little more in the folk herb vein and allowed these two to be used side by side and to still value our traditional roots and have this additional layer of the emergency medicine and such that we have that's so powerful from convention, our modern day medicine. I hate calling it conventional medicine because it's not really conventional. I think we'll get to where there's a balanced place where we have both of these layers, much like other parts of the world where they're practiced side by side, and it's a lot less esoteric and having to pick one or the other.
Yeah, I think it helps to have guys like you, and then, like as I mentioned, Carter, the 16-year-old, telling me about this. So it's like, so if they, somebody's talking to you and they're like, oh, he has long hair and a beard, kind of this hippie guy talking about this plant talking to him. Okay, dude, whatever.
Right.
But when you start talking about the chemicals, and the names of the chemicals, what vitamins it is, the Latin name, the this, and you have all that science also, and you can, it maybe like depends on who you're talking to, but so you can talk science to the person, and then be like, and you know what else? The plants can actually talk to you. They are talking to you. You just don't know how to listen. And so I think that helps to have these kinds of conversations where it's not just this far out sounding stuff. Get this, you got the science, and then you have this, like, well, this guy is obviously well educated and can prove with science, and he's also saying this other stuff. Like there's another level of consciousness, and that. So when we were talking about you coming on the show, and I was asking you what you'd want to talk about, and you said plant consciousness, I thought, man, that's a really cool subject, and kind of what the show is all about, like fitness and consciousness, and like what does that even mean for like all these different people? So if like do you see like I guess you were kind of just talking about like the Western medicine, like modern medicine, if you will, like getting into the herbalism and Like,
Mm-hmm.
are you seeing like? Do you have like other like advice on how they could get into it if you have like this Western knowledge, or are you talking about like the
Mm-hmm,
nurse?
mm-hmm.
And so this nurse can say, well, actually, you can. Like, do you have like good segues for these?
There are some things that I would consider kind of the low-hanging fruits that would be pretty accessible for more conventional medical folks and nutritionists and their licensed healthcare practitioners. And there are like these vestiges of holdouts of things. Like I had not too long ago talked with someone who had been hospitalized with third-degree burns over much of their body at some point in their life, not recently, but they were coated in bandages wrapped with honey in the hospital. And this is a traditional burn remedy that people have used for thousands of years. It's very effective. It helps to protect the burns while allowing them to be weepy and helping to kind of control some of the moisture and preventing infection without putting something in there that has to come out again later. It's like readily soluble and can just be rinsed out by the body's own processes versus like putting a plant in there that has to come out for the tissue to heal.
I had heard of that before, the honey thing.
Yeah, it's quite effective. I mean, I've used other tree saps on burns. That's a whole different bag of worms. But yeah, there's still things like that happen in hospitals. There is a growing movement towards research and what I would say are more balanced ecological approaches to healing, like breaking down gangrenous tissue using sterile maggots that can eat that tissue and they won't touch the healthy tissue. And this is not necessarily like the low-hanging fruit for clinicians to start using maggots in their practice. Good luck with that. But there are things like infused oils that nurses could probably be using with some of their people to help improve skin tone. Just using calendula oil could go a long way for a lot of folks, probably, for a variety of like. I'm thinking in my mind about like people working with elder care, and there's a tendency towards bed sores and fungal infections of the skin due to kind of the dampness that's there, and then the dry sort of more vata-like skin that the elderly tend to get, and that could be improved a lot with just something like calendula oil, a very simple marigold-infused oil that's been used for an awful long time in the European tradition. I used it as a diaper oil for my son. My son has only been to the doctor for regular checkups, and he's not needed any kind of prescription at this point in his life. We've used entirely herbal medicine with him, and it's been powerful. There's been several times that I've stayed out of the doctor's office or hospital using herbal medicine. And there's been other times that, antibiotics have saved my life. So I certainly wouldn't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think there's a place for both, for herbal medicine and conventional pharmaceutical type medicine. They each have their strengths and their weaknesses. And for me, I'm going to go to, obviously I'm a little biased here, but I'm going to go to the herbal medicine first, if I can, unless it's an emergency situation. Sometimes I use that analogy like, would you go to your herbalist if you broke your leg, or are you going to go to the hospital? It's a pretty easy decision to make, right?
Yeah.
But for other things, it's a little more ambiguous. Like, are you going to have your baby at home or in the hospital? People have been having babies naturally.
Long time.
For a long time. So, yeah, do you need to go to the hospital and spend thousands of dollars on a hospital room and for a physician to be there? And the chances are of them intervening, it's probably for their own convenience, for their schedule, rather than whether or not you really need to have that C-section that day. So I'm not trying to slander any OB physicians out there, forgive me. But I've seen this in practice. It's come up in research on the medical system, and there are a lot of issues that I think that a healthy dose of herbalism could really help.
So, like with having the baby at home, what are you mean for that? Like, what made you mention that?
I don't know.
Or you just mean that like sometimes you need to go to the hospital and sometimes you don't.
Yeah.
Was that the basic?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Is that I think we in our culture, we've come to a place where we really take our own authority for our health and out of ourselves, and we've externalized that authority for our health to physicians and to blood tests and to bacterial cultures and whatever else outside of us, rather than listening to our bodies and wondering, what can I do to help myself, and thinking about that. So that's growing. That mindset is growing a lot, and people are taking more more steps to enable themselves with their health, and I think that's powerful. So I feel like the trend is moving towards greater integration of all these things in our culture now. And I feel like we're coming out of an age where there's just, again, these illusions of our separateness from nature, the better living through chemistry, and that we're seeing now, it's been generations, it's been long enough, we're seeing the weaknesses of that approach and coming back to a more balanced position in it.
Yeah, you gave us a lot of really interesting things to talk about, from like the esoteric to the real, just science. And so if did you have some like closing thoughts, like how can people get a hold of you to take classes, or just like learn more about what you have going on here?
Well, I teach classes mostly for adults at White Pine Wilderness Academy in Rocky Ripple, Indiana. So if you are local to me in central Indiana, we offer adult classes on weeknights in foraging and medicine making. I'm also doing a series of weekend campouts where we'll go forage and gather medicines and make medicines together in more distant regional places in Indiana. So you can find more information about those on our website at whitepinewilderness.com. I also do health consultations, and I make medicines and sell those from my home-based business, Wild Persimmon School of Wellness, which you can find more information at wildpersimmonwellness.com. And if you're not local to me here in Indianapolis, then I would recommend you try to find someone in your community that's local who can teach you about the plants that grow in your area that are common there, any ecological considerations that there may be for gathering or preserving those plants. And chances are, no matter where you are in the United States or elsewhere, there is a local herbalist, healer that could help you learn those skills and help you probably with your health too. So yeah, that's where I would go.
That's really good. So if they want to get a hold of you, just go to your website, and then your contact information is on there.
That's right. Yep.
All right. Well, thanks for being on the show. Do you have any other closing thoughts, or?
Thanks, Ryan. I'm really happy to be here, and I have really enjoyed this conversation about plants and consciousness. And I would just encourage any listeners out there to try to spend, next time you're out in nature and you're alone, try to take, let's say, 10 nice deep breaths with a plant and center yourself and try to listen from your heart and see if that plant has something that it wants to tell you.
That's a great way to end it. Thanks for listening to Fitness and Consciousness. If you want to get a hold of me about the show, you can do so at fitnessandconsciousness@gmail.com.